Section 3 of Chapter 10 is on assessing monopoly. And in particular, we're going to ask the question, are monopolies good or bad for society in terms of social welfare? So we developed these tools of consumer surplus and producer surplus in a previous chapter. It was in Chapter 4 that we developed the tools of consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus. And now we're going to use these tools to answer the question of whether monopoly is good or bad for society. So first, let's revisit the monopolist's problem. How does it decide what quantity to produce and price to charge? Okay, so let's revisit the monopolist's problem of determining quantity and price. First, step 1, determine the curves. The demand is assumed to be a straight line. Marginal revenue, therefore, is twice as steep. Now let's look at the cost curves. Say marginal cost looks like this, and average cost looks like this. Remember that the average total cost curve and the marginal cost curve intersect here. In other words, the marginal cost curve intersects the average cost curve at its minimum point. The way to remember this is there's an analogy between grade point average and grade in the next class. So that's the mathematical reason why they intersect there. But in any case, we can now move on to step 2. Determine what quantity the monopolist will produce. What quantity is that? The quantity where marginal revenue and marginal cost intersect. In other words, this Q star is the optimal quantity. Now what price should it charge? The answer is whatever people are willing to pay. And so we go up from this Q star until we hit the demand curve and then go over. We can charge this price P star. Okay, let's assess the efficiency in terms of consumer surplus. What's the consumer surplus? The area under the demand curve and above the price. So in other words, this area here. So this is the consumer surplus that the consumers are getting. But let's say the government took the following action. It split this monopoly up into 10 different companies, or maybe 100 different companies. Anyway, enough companies so that they would be perfect competition. And assume that the production technology didn't change. So these cost curves remain the same. Then if we sum them up, the industry supply curve would look like this marginal cost curve. It wouldn't be the entire marginal cost curve, but only that portion of it above what? Average variable cost. So in any case, if we split this up, we would have the following. This marginal cost will become a supply curve. We call it a supply curve. And we can ignore this for now. Okay, so we broke up this company, and now we have a supply curve. What's the price going to be? How is the price going to be determined in this competitive market? By the intersection of supply and demand, right? So the new price will be found by the intersection of supply and demand. It'll be PC for price competitive. And the quantity will be QC. So certainly consumers are going to be better off, right? Because they're going to pay a lower price, and they're also going to get to consume more quantity. And we see that in the consumer surplus, which again is the area below the demand curve and above the price. So the consumer surplus rises from this small green triangle to this large green triangle. There's a similar figure in the chapter. Here what's going on, again, we have a monopoly. The monopolist determines its quantity based on where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It decides to produce QM. It decides to charge a price of PM for that, because this is the most that consumers will be willing to pay. So what's the consumer surplus associated with this price PM and this quantity QM? The answer is it's the area under the demand curve and above the price. So this triangle is consumer surplus. But if we had a competitive industry, then the price would be determined by the intersection of supply and demand. In other words, here. Because again, the industry supply curve would be the horizontal summation of all individual firm marginal cost curves. In other words, the price would be here. And so consumer surplus, before it was this small triangle, would rise to this whole triangle. So this would be the addition. This part that I'm shading in blue is the additional consumer surplus that consumers would get. And not only that, producer surplus would also rise. Because remember, the monopolist was only producing QM. So it was not getting any of this surplus. This was lost. But if it moves to a competitive industry, this becomes the gains to the producers. So you might think, why is it that a monopolist would give up getting some surplus? Well, the answer is we made an assumption about pricing. And that is the monopolist has to charge the same price to everyone. It turns out the monopolist would do better if it could charge different prices to different people. But because it can't, it stops selling after QM. It doesn't sell anymore. Even though there are people out there who are willing to pay more than the marginal cost of production, it doesn't sell to them. Because in order to sell to them, the monopolist would have to lower its price, but that means lower its price for everyone, including the people who are already buying it. And so that's why there's a deadweight loss. Let me say this all together, all at one time. So if we had a competitive market, the price would be PC. This blue area would be producer surplus. And then this red area would be consumer surplus. But because we have a monopoly, we don't get this area here at all. No one gets that area. And not only that, but part of the consumer surplus is transferred to the producers. So this becomes part of producer surplus. So there are two things to notice here. The first is that total surplus is smaller. That means the monopolist is inefficient from the standpoint of social welfare. Second thing to notice is, of the surplus that is there, the producers are capturing part of the consumer's surplus. And so you might say that's inequitable. Now there are two ways of thinking about this. One is that, yes, the consumers are the little guys, the firms are the big guys, and so the big guys are taking surplus from the little guys. That might be true. On the other hand, it's important to keep in mind that in a modern capitalist economy, who owns these firms? The shareholders, right? And who are the shareholders? Some little guys are shareholders, right? Like I own some shares, you probably do, your parents probably do. And so it's difficult to make a distinction sometimes between who are the producers and who are the consumers. I guess you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But in any case, it is possible to say that this is an inequitable outcome. It could be, in some cases, possible to say that. Finally, there's some discussion in this part of the chapter about the concentration of power. And I would summarize it as follows. If a firm doesn't face any competition, then do they have any incentive to make their product better? Not really, maybe, unless they're going to be able to charge more for it. If it would shift the demand curve out, then they would. But it seems in some sense that there's less incentive. This is outside the model, by the way. On the other hand, it could be that monopolists are actually more inventive. And one famous economist named Joseph Schumpeter thought that actually monopolists would innovate more than firms in perfectly competitive markets would. For one reason, monopolists have the profits that they can reinvest back into technology development. So there's a debate actually among economists of whether monopolists are more or less innovative than firms in perfectly competitive industries. So I'll just put this as an open debate to you. You might think about it and maybe write about it. And that was some of the points touched on here. Oh, there was one final aspect here about the fragility of monopoly power. Well, we talked about Microsoft earlier in this lecture today. Well, Microsoft's power is being eroded very quickly. It used to be that if you wanted to do word processing or spreadsheet applications, Microsoft Office products were really, for many people, the only practical choice, because you can swap files with people and so on. But what's happened over really only the last 10 years is that file formats became more compatible and there are more options available. So even though about 15 years ago, Microsoft was being sued by the US government for being a monopolist, it seems like so much has changed now that Google is the one who's in danger of being sued for being a monopolist. And Microsoft is almost, it's maybe not perfectly competitive, but certainly there are fewer barriers to entry to the software market now.